Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore. Today on the show, we have Simon Ruffell, a psychiatrist living in London, who's a student of ayahuasca, doing research and participating in current
Mm,
training of curanderismo.
you're right. Yeah, that's it.
Beautiful. What tradition are you getting connected with there? Is it the Shipibo lineages or?
It is, yeah. So it's one specific lineage of the Shipibo. So it's specifically the Lopez Malwa lineage, which are basically two families that came together and formed this one particular lineage. So I work exclusively with that family.
Cool. So let's rewind the tape here. So,
Mm.
all right, what came first, interest in medicine or interest in psychedelic healing?
Mm. Interest in Western medicine definitely came first. So, yeah, I mean, I was always really, really fascinated with the human mind, particularly interested in psychosis, but also people in general. Just kind of what makes people tick, what happens when the mind kind of so-called goes wrong, and then what do we do to help people? I just found that fascinating. I found delusions, hallucinations, all of those kind of things were really, really interesting. And so that led me to go to medical school, which was a good 6 years of not looking at that and, learning all of the names of the bones in the foot, for example, which didn't really interest me. But then finally I got through medical school, did my foundation years in general medicine and made it into psychiatry. And I did really love it. I did really love it. Like I found it really interesting. I loved the patients. I loved most of the staff that we were working with, were super cool, especially the nurses. But the main issue that I had with it was that most of the time our treatments didn't work. And I'm talking here about kind of pharmacological treatments. Psychotherapy. It can be fantastic if it's done well. And obviously it takes ages, or it depends on the therapist. But I found that for a lot of the conditions that we were treating, our patients just kept coming back time and time again. And that really began to get me down. So I began thinking about other ways that you could treat mental health conditions. I thought maybe there'd be some answers outside of the Western medical paradigm further afield. And that led me in a roundabout way to the Shipibo.
I love that. So I'm seeing some analogy here with things like Groff, right? You're like, oh, you did all this psychiatry training, not psychiatry, so psychoanalytic training, and you're like, this wasn't really all that amazing.
Yeah, which is a bit of a bummer, seeing as that took me 15 years, and then I got there and was like, okay, maybe there's another way that we could be doing this, or a better way.
Yeah, so when did the concept of psychedelics, medical psychedelics, or plant medicines like in the Amazon come up for you, and what were your curiosities like at that point?
I mean, my first contact with psychedelics definitely wasn't the medicinal use. It was just recreational use at university. And I found them really, really helpful. Like many people around me were finding them very helpful. Some people obviously had terrible experiences because the setting wasn't right. It was being used in all kinds of situations. But I remember hearing about ayahuasca and being completely fascinated by it, being really intrigued when I was at med school in the UK. And I did get offered it a couple of times, but it was always by some sketchy guy in a tracksuit saying, just come to my flat. And I was like, I feel like maybe this should be done in a different way. And so I was primed by the time I got to Central and South America with this interest. But it was really by a stroke of fate, as I kind of think of it. I found myself sitting next to the man who would later become my teacher, the curandero who would become my teacher. In a cafe when he was on holiday from Peru in Guatemala. He'd been training with the Shipibo for a number of years. And when I was sitting next to him and I was explaining my qualms with psychiatry, and saying I'm not against drug treatments. I think there's a role for them for sure to maintain people's safety, to maintain, the safety of the participants, the patients, and also other people. But they just weren't kind of cutting the mustard. They weren't good enough. And he was saying, well, I've been working with ayahuasca and I've been treating most of the conditions that you've been talking about with relative ease. In psychiatry, we don't even use the term cure. You just don't use that. psychiatry is largely a palliative specialty. And he seemed to be saying, oh, no, we use it. We have great results. And we do it through a completely different method. We do it through communicating with spirits, and then the spirits heal people on our behalf. And I was kind of thinking, well, come on, really? Is that, you're just saying that out loud? Really? Okay. And he said, well, come with me and I'll show you. And so I did.
That's wild. I love that.
Yeah, it was super wild. It gets wilder.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Sure does. So, okay, so relatively traditional psychiatric training. Then you're getting this kind of, like, as Joe Taffer puts it in his book, like a fellowship of the river kind of deal, where you're, well, actually, like, what? So you had your first experience. Was it so compelling that you needed to return?
I mean, the answer to that is clearly yes, because I did keep coming back. So that was 2015. But it's funny though, because I remember after that first ayahuasca experience, I did a retreat in the Amazon rainforest in Peru, and it was amazing. And I found it really, really helpful, but I wasn't, I definitely wasn't thinking I'm going to train in curanderismo, and I'm going to devote my life to ayahuasca, like not at all. So I finished that retreat and I ended up calling one of my friends who's a psychologist back in the UK from Iquitos. And I was saying, yeah, I've just experienced ayahuasca. It's fantastic. It's absolutely amazing. And I remember saying, it's a fantastic antidepressant, and it's really, really, really good, like anti-anxiety medication, I feel. And I feel there's a real big gap in Western medicine. And so we started talking about that and decided that we were going to do research into ayahuasca. And to be completely honest, I thought, this is 2015, I thought I'd do this study into ayahuasca, and that'd be great. That's the time I did a study into ayahuasca. And I thought that would be it. And we ended up doing a self-funded study, because nobody wanted to fund our research back then, into ayahuasca and personality. And then after that, we got some funding through the Medical Research Council, which is part of the UK government, off the back of that, which was it was a real surprise to me. I was, very, very grateful for that. And it wasn't until 2019, when I've been going back and forwards to the Amazon rainforest for about 4 years, working with the curanderos, having repeated conversations about, what was quote unquote real, were spirits real, was what I was experiencing just in my mind, or was it outside of it? Could it be considered delusion or hallucination? And then in 2019, my whole perception of reality completely shifted. It was actually when I was doing my PhD. I ended up doing a PhD into Amazonian ayahuasca and mental health. And when that happened, this experience happened that I just couldn't explain. I couldn't deny. And almost overnight, my perception of reality almost entirely shifted. Admittedly, up until that point, I've been struggling more and more to explain my experiences from a Western point of view. I was repeatedly getting laughed at by the curanderos I was working with, and Simon's trying to explain this like through the brain again. But then when that happened, I couldn't explain it, and I almost immediately shifted to a Shipibo understanding, to a traditional understanding of the way that ayahuasca was working. And I decided to start training in curanderismo, a couple of weeks following that. I've been following that path pretty seriously since then.
So, okay, and now you've got all of this training from kind of the Western approach, and now you're deeply investigating curanderismo. Like, how are you in your practice? Like, how are you able to conceptualize things as, normal diseases now, given that there's this kind of animist worldview that you're also getting, steeped in, where things might have different kinds of causes than a bacteria or other.
For sure. I mean, I think it's really easy to disregard other people's knowledge systems, and so for most Western scientists, it's super easy to just say, that couldn't possibly be true. It couldn't possibly be true that there are entities, that there are spirits, that there are demons that are affecting people. And it couldn't possibly be true because that couldn't be true. And you just disregard it. And then equally, I know a lot of people who have gone down the indigenous medicine path and just completely disregard science, completely disregard medicine. And they're both really valid, equally valid ways of understanding the universe, ways of providing treatment. So the way that I perceive it now is that, take ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is a beautiful example. Does ayahuasca work by DMT binding to serotonin receptors in the brain, enhancing neuroplasticity? Yes, absolutely, 100%. That's one of the ways that it can work. We know that from all of our scientific research. But is ayahuasca also a vessel that takes us into the spirit world, that allows us to connect with various entities, some of them malevolent, some of them benevolent? Is it that the curanderos call on those entities to heal the participants on their behalf, and that's how the healing works? In my experience, yes, 100%. They are both equally true, and they're both equally valid. So I find myself in a situation now where I kind of wear two hats and try not to place one above the other.
It's a delicate dance.
It's a super it's maddening, Joe. Honestly, it's completely maddening. Well, it was for years, but then it definitely got easier. But when I was first getting into this, to begin with, before this experience in 2019, I thought like I was losing my mind. I felt that I was having these experiences, and I remember thinking, this is wow, like I'm either really onto something, and these curanderos who I work with and who I trust and who I've known now for 4 years are really onto something, and this is potentially the biggest blind spot in the whole of Western science, or I'm really losing it. And it's either one of the two, and I'm just not sure which one. I'm pretty sure it's that there is a massive blind spot in science. I'm convinced of that, actually.
Yeah. I was listening to a article by I think a writer at The Guardian about this thinker, Jeffrey Kripal, is a philosophy professor at Rice, and he was talking about this this need for us to really update a lot of our models, and this is consistent with like a lot of our colonized training with our teachers at Dream Shadow, kind of inclusive of the Alfred North Whitehead process philosophy framework. And the idea is that we're in our culture is still operating in this Newtonian paradigm, and we really we're living in a quantum world now. We're really not updating any of our models. We're kind of making major mistakes in the way we're structuring a lot of our studies, because we're making these kind of Newtonian assumptions when we need to like figure out how do we become intelligent enough to make appropriate new quantum founded kind of things that allow for this kind of spirit worldview, and like allow us to understand that. And then he also said, let's just let science be science.
Yeah.
And then the other traditions can be other things. And this came up last night at Harvard too. It's like there's these other ways of knowing, and science is one spectacular way of knowing, but it's not complete, right? It's only ever going to take, and nothing really can be complete, but it's going to take really small incremental chunks of progress. We sometimes want to see leaps much faster than that. And
for sure.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that rant?
Yeah, totally. I mean, so Peter Hughes, he talks a lot about this, like speaking about being in this age of brain faith is what he calls it, where we're in this dog. I know, I love it. We're in this dogma of science. And the definition of a dogma is that you don't realize that you're in it, because everyone accepts that it must be true. And if you begin to think otherwise, then that's ridiculous. That couldn't possibly be true. But we're beginning to see science fail. For example, the heart problem of consciousness. We can't explain that. So how do we move out of that? I mean, I feel that metaphysics is a really good way that we can bridge those paradigms, because as soon as you start saying kind of spirits, entities, all of these things, people begin to zone out. People begin to tune out. For me, I used to be very kind of eye-rolling with that. I'd be like, energy, really? What is that? Unless you're a physicist, then you shouldn't really be speaking about it. What kind of energy are you talking about? But when we begin to describe these things in terms of metaphysics, it provides a framework that people in many different paradigms can understand, and they can come to respect and acknowledge these different ways of thinking.
Yeah, Peter's been really helpful in helping me understand this stuff too. Yeah, I like to go back to Robert Anton Wilson, a collaborator of Timothy Leary, about this concept of reality tunnels. Like, if you want a really clear, a much more clear picture of reality, it's not like this kind of slightly updated monkey hardware is going to do it, right? Like, we have to kind of put on a bunch of different softwares. Like, let's put on Marxism for a moment. Let's put in, these other 20 things to say, oh, now I have a way better read on this scenario. And I think these traditional approaches, there's a lot of data there. There's a lot of stuff that we can add on to our models.
Oh, for sure. In many of these traditions, it's hard to know exactly how old they are. But in my perception, they are a form of science. What is science? Science is when you test things, when you have a hypothesis, when you see what works, you see what doesn't work, you come to a conclusion, and then you move forward. I think it's unfortunate that science seems to be mistaken as a bit of belief system now, when it actually is not. It's a way of testing and a way of exploring things. And I really had this in my mind when I was doing my PhD and I started training in curanderismo, and I was in the Amazon on a grant from from the UK government. I don't think they know I started training in curanderismo when I was on that grant in the Amazon doing that data collection. But I remember thinking, should I be doing this? Should I be starting this training, beginning to engage? And then I thought, well, as a real scientist, like, surely you have to, if you want to really see what's out there, you want to really do an experiment. And there seems to be other ways of knowing that other people are wanting to teach you. For me, the curiosity was just too much. I couldn't say no.
That's fair. It's a really interesting thing. Like, once you start encountering the numinous and you're like, wait a second, well, how would it be? It's like, an analogy would be like, you're used to going to normal meditation clubs, right? Like, or meetups. And then all of a sudden you go to one in a different country and people are flying or something. You're like, wait a second, how do I do that? You guys are clearly in the know on something that I don't know. Please teach me, or something along those lines. Yeah.
For sure. I mean, especially as a psychiatrist whose profession is failing. And then you come across these curanderos who say, yeah, I can teach you, and this is incredible. But then, in my experience, you get a whole lot more than you bargain for when you start training in that paradigm. And try explaining that to other psychiatrists. It's super challenging.
Right. Well, can you speak a little bit about that? Like, I don't. The idea that shamanism is like an ideal career, or like position in culture, is like misunderstood. Like, if you're in Los Angeles, it might look attractive to have that be your career, but like, if you're in a traditional culture, it's a big job and not very pretty, right? Can you speak about that more than you bargained for concept?
Yeah, I mean, one of my bugbears is people in the West who kind of say, I'm a shaman or I'm a curandero. And then you kind of speak to them, and they've been to the Amazon for, I don't know, 2 months. Or they did a course and they got a certificate at the end of it. And it's like, no. This is, the training has to and should be more extensive than Western medicine. It has to, in my opinion, because you're tapping into different realms than you do in Western medicine. So in Western medicine, we're largely treating people physiologically, and sometimes psychologically as well, physiologically. But in the Shipibo way of understanding how treatment works, how health works, you have these three planes of existence. And it's all about balance. So you have the spiritual plane at the top. And if you become out of balance in the spiritual plane, most people probably wouldn't feel it. If you're particularly sensitive, you might pick up on it. And if you don't treat that, then it starts manifesting on the psychological plane. And so you might begin to get depression, anxiety, whatever else. And if you don't correct that imbalance, it begins to manifest on the physical plane. And so already, from the Shipibo understanding of how health and illness works, you already have this spiritual component that Western medicine just largely doesn't acknowledge. And that's before you get into the whole concept of the spirit world, the Aninuta in Shipibo, where you have all of these entities that exist, some of them good, some of them bad, all of which you can engage with. And what's fascinating is that from a Shipibo point of view, and from what I've learned and experienced, most people in the West, whether you believe it or not, have these things stuck to them. So when you go to an ayahuasca ceremony, when you sit with the Shipibo, it doesn't matter whether you believe it or not. You know, the Shipibo will likely say, okay, yeah, you have this positive energy. You have some ancestors who are helping you out. Or you have something stuck to you. You've got to remove that. That needs to be removed. So I really feel that the responsibility to be a curandero is as much as a Western medical doctor, if not higher, almost definitely higher, because of what you're engaging with. And there's a real risk of people from the global north thinking they get it when they don't. And then that becomes super dangerous. So in Western medicine, we have this kind of joke, at least in the UK, that the most dangerous people in the hospital are the year 3 medical students, because they have got to the point where they think they know loads and actually they know nothing. And so they run around the hospital doing kind of pointless procedures and kind of making decisions that they're not qualified to do. And my concern is that we have that in the global north at the moment, with people dabbling in curanderismo, dabbling in shamanism, and thinking that they've got it sorted, thinking that they know what's going on. They don't. They don't. And that can really mess people up. We've got to be really careful of that.
So I've been developing a relationship with somebody from the Native American church for a while. And he, and so for those who don't know, that's the peyote tradition, US, Canadian, Mexican kind of peyote tradition. And I think a thing that has been brought up by him a bunch to me is around this idea of danger from, or like risk from, spiritual encounters that you might not be ready for, and or the container is not right for. Can you speak to that in the Shipibo, understanding?
For sure. I mean, my kind of concern with this is specifically to do with psychedelics as a psychotherapy in the West. So obviously we have, the so-called psychedelic renaissance. We have a lot of people getting really interested with psychedelics. And quite often that the psychedelics are provided in an insufficient container. Now, one thing that no one's really talking about, or very few people are talking about, is whether or not the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy container is sufficient. And this I find really interesting and kind of amazing that people aren't talking about this. Well, I mean, indigenous people are, but people in the West. And so Don Rono Lopez, who I apprenticed with in the Amazon rainforest, when I was speaking to him about the use of psychedelics in hospitals, he was kind of saying, okay, well, that's great that you guys are taking an interest in these medicines. Finally, that's awesome. Tell me, who do you have to work with the energies? Who do you have to remove energetic blockages? Who do you have to remove negative energies? And I was kind of saying, well, we don't really talk about that. We don't really use those terms in psychiatry and in psychology. And he was saying, well, okay, but you must have somebody there in case you've got to do, an emergency exorcism. Like, what do you do if there's a demon that comes in? What do you do if something like that happens? And I was saying, well, again, we don't really use those terms, kind of exorcism and demon and things like that in psychology and psychiatry. And his response was, that's incredibly dangerous not to have that container, not to have somebody there who knows how to work with these energies, somebody who's trained. And I think that applies to all ceremonies as well. I unfortunately have had the experience of being in spaces that haven't been held properly, and it can be terrifying. Everything can come in, and if you don't know what that is, then you have no frame of reference. You just leave feeling undone. You leave feeling a lot worse. So I think we need to think really carefully about how we're setting up these spaces, both in hospital settings, because having a psychiatrist there isn't necessarily a good thing. That isn't necessarily the person you need, in my experience. And of course, the same goes for just any kind of ceremony as well.
So it's very similar to what my colleague has been telling me from his perspective. Like the results are still fairly good in clinical trials, right? Like, so I've been kind of joking about this from the ketamine perspective recently. It's like, even though a lot of it's administered quite suboptimally from the perspective of most of us, like we could be doing a lot better. the results are still good somehow. Like relative, especially to a lot of traditional psychiatric interventions.
Mhm.
And then, when I look at studies at Hopkins, like it seems consistent across a lot of studies, even with other institutions, which are about 2/3 success rate, roughly
Mhm.
speaking. And like, how do we balance that with this extraordinary danger, but with like that person might have died anyway? Like, how do we balance that? And yeah, okay. So two questions here. How do we balance this? And then like what would a pathway look like to
Mm,
improving this energetic situation in Western clinical
for
trials and
sure.
treatments?
Yeah, good questions. I mean, I'm definitely not against the hospital-based use of psychedelics in clinical trials, and I've been involved in them throughout my career at different times. And you're right, the results that we get are often really, really good, but they could be so much better. They could be so much better if we had somebody who knew how to use that tool properly. Yeah, and this is many Indigenous people have been speaking to this as well. So at Psychedelic Science in 2023, the Ashaninka leader Benki got up and basically, I'm paraphrasing, but basically said, don't do this without us. Don't do this without Indigenous peoples. And it's not because Indigenous peoples are, for ethical reasons and reciprocity, all of that stuff is really important to like for sure. But they're there to support us because they know how to work with these things, because they understand how these medicines work from a traditional perspective. So what is the way forward with that? I mean, it's tricky. I mean, I fully believe that the way that we move forward in terms of science and maybe even humanity in general as well. I mean, I don't think the psychedelics are going to transform the world, but I think that they can do their bit along with many other things. And I think that the way that we can ensure that is by having a blend of the two paradigms, but through collaboratively working together. And there are some places where that's beginning to happen now. So, for example, in Australia, some of the dyads that they have in some of their studies have one Indigenous person and one psychiatrist or one psychologist, which is fantastic. That's a really great way to move forward. And I think that having that would be a really good way that we can maintain safety and that we could increase the efficacy of using these medicines, and that is not placing one way of knowing in a dominant position to the other.
So to speak to the Australia thing, is this like a person with specialized training in their tradition, like an ancient wisdom holder kind of thing?
It is, but you're obviously limited by what you can do in the hospital. So, I mean, they're unlikely to be able to, I don't know, start singing Icaros and to remove a spirit from somebody and to engage in all of that. But having them there, having their presence, there are many other things that you can do to help make sure that that space is held well. So, for example, setting up the container, making sure that the intentions are there, approaching the land, getting permission from the land. There are all of these things that you can do. But I think that this is, in Australia, this is the first step. This is really the beginning of what could be a beautiful way of doing it. And maybe we can't do that in hospitals. Maybe we won't be able to do that in a Western medical system. Maybe it will be in an adjacent way of working with these medicines. So, for example, like acupuncture, that's not recognized by most kind of medical institutions, but they have their own boards to make sure that acupuncture is delivered well, it's delivered effectively, and that it's safe. And maybe there'll be those kind of new boards that appear for the use of psychedelics. Ideally, in my opinion, with both Indigenous and Western people involved in the implementation of that.
Yeah. A ministry of magic.
We could call it that.
I think it's interesting in concept and theory, like how to do this. I wonder if anybody would want to study, and I think this would be really interesting, to people trained in curanderismo with a psychiatric background, running one arm, and this is MDMA, so that it's like spiritless from certain perspectives, not really, but kind of, and then then traditionally trained people from the Western perspective, and then 30 people on each side, and then like where's the data point, and like what methods were used in these MDMA trials on either side, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, but another qualm that I have is trying to squeeze these traditional practices into these Western psychological frameworks, into the Western research. And we come across this all the time with the organization that I run called Onaya. And we're based in the Peruvian Amazon, and we work exclusively with Shipibo curanderos. We come up with the ideas for studies together. We interpret the results together, and then we make sure those results have gone out to the communities in a way that's easily understood by them as much as possible as well. And even with us devoting our lives to trying to bridge that gap, it's really, really difficult to do. And so let me give you an example. So a little while ago, Don Rono said that he wanted to look at the effects of different Icaros on his participants. So he wanted to see the effect of a healing Icaro versus the effect of a protection Icaro, for example. And so I immediately thought, oh my goodness, like, how do we do this? And we sat down and we thought long and hard about it. We're like, okay, one thing that we could do is something called EEG hyperscanning. So we can put EEGs on multiple participants within a ceremony. We can record Rono singing his Icaros, and we can timestamp it. Then we can translate all of that Shipibo into English, so we can see when he's singing protection versus when he's singing healing. Then we can record people's brain waves, and then we can timestamp that. And then we can look at the impact that different Icaros have on brain waves. And we thought, that's it. We've cracked it. Fantastic. And then afterwards, when I was speaking to Rono and we were kind of talking about the data and talking about the EEGs and how they work, and he just said, well, Simon, I have my own caps on each of you in ceremonies that picks up on everything that's going on with you, but in the spirit world, and mine are far superior to yours. And it's kind of a mic drop moment, but at that point, I suddenly realized, did Rono mean look at the brain waves? Are Icaros going to be affecting brain waves, or does he mean something else, something that scientists can't measure yet? And so my concern with the measures that we would use in these studies is it just feels a bit obsolete. You kind of go through this incredible experience where you clean your ancestral lines, you meet these entities, you have contact with your dead mother, for example, and then somebody gives you a questionnaire saying, do you feel less depressed than you did before? There's 20 questions. And my question is, are we even close to measuring the spiritual side of these things? Is science advanced enough to pick up on those things? And my belief at the moment is no, we're not yet. And that requires science to really eat a big piece of humble pie, which I think most scientists aren't quite ready to do.
So when you look at somebody like Robin Carhart Harris, who has this kind of like hyper kind of focus, importantly, I think, doing a lot of brain imaging work, neural circuitry work, great neuroscience stuff, but like thinking that those things are going to get us to some grand unified theory of psyche or mind body or something like that. How do you kind of respond to that kind of hyper drive to like, this is the thing that's going to get it? We only had better cameras.
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally behind all the work that Robin does. It's fantastic, and as you say, fantastic neuroscientist. And I think neuroscience as a specialty is amazing. It's absolutely incredible. Science as a discipline is absolutely incredible. And I'm primarily a scientist, so I'm all for this. And I think we should keep pushing forward. We should keep investigating. That's super important. But I also think there's only so far that science can get us right now because of the technology that we have. I don't see any distinction between science and spirituality. And if humanity survives long enough, I feel that they're going to be unified. That Shipibo talk about infinite dimensions, that each plant has its own dimension with a vast number of spirits that exist within that dimension. My feeling is that, I don't know, fast forward 1,000 years, 2,000 years, however many thousand years, that some civilization would be able to demonstrate that through science, and there would be no faith that's needed. I don't see a difference between them, but I feel that we're so far away from that having a unified theory, I mean, it'd be great if it happens, and I'm all for exploring it. But I really think that the way that we advance science, and I'm including indigenous knowledge in this, to advance it significantly in the shortest period of time, would be to collaborate between these different paradigms, share our knowledge, rather than just kind of trickling forward as we move forward very slowly with science.
That would be really fascinating. Last night I was exposed to the concept of kind of indigenous-led anthropology work, where like I somehow I missed this. I'm not really sure how, but there's this concept of, not only does institutions like a Harvard will like own all of this IP that was given by the indigenous, way back, like, who owns Maria Sabina's like talks, for instance? Like that's a fascinating question. And now we can kind of like pivot to say, oh, this is no longer like some subject object research. It's like us investigating ourselves kind of thing. And I really liked that quite a bit. And I think if there was some indigenous or like, First Nations, original people kind of self-reflective research into this, I think that would be really fascinating to fund something along those lines. What does your organization do? I somehow forgot to ask you that. Is this it?
Yeah, so we do not-for-profit research, trying to bridge that gap in collaboration with Indigenous peoples. Almost all of it's looking at ayahuasca. We are beginning to branch out a little bit now to psilocybin too, but it's mainly ayahuasca. And we look at a wide variety of things. So we've been looking at personality, common mental health conditions, epigenetic change. And most recently, we're beginning to look at military veterans suffering from PTSD. So we're working in collaboration with the Heroic Hearts Project, which is a fantastic charity. And so we're looking at veterans that are brought to the Amazon rainforest, to where we do our research at the Research and Retreat Center. And we're assessing them in terms of psychometrics, EEG, gut microbiome, epigenetics, kind of the full works. And yeah, trying to do that as much as possible in the traditional context, so that we can demonstrate that that is important and it's not just about the molecules.
Yeah, having it not be purely about the molecules is important, but let's cycle back. This is actually an interesting one, and I'm really curious about your perspectives here. So, I personally try to stay away from things like I've had ayahuasca, once, very helpful, extraordinary experience, but I kind of almost purposely stay away from it and other kind of traditional practices around psychedelics, because I'm, an American, right? Like what do I have to do with ayahuasca culture? Like, shouldn't LSD and MDMA be my culture, right? Like, and then, there's this kind of reflexive thing around those molecules not necessarily having spirit, because they're man-made, but I think there's an interesting schism. Like, I'm not part of nature, therefore, like, anything I create isn't also part of nature. So, like, potential fallacy there too. But like, how do you like to look at these synthetic molecules that are, quite popular, both spiritually, recreationally, medically, and then like, how can I kind of make sense of these perspectives that I keep getting kind of exposed to?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So, I mean, my worldview is largely informed by my work and training with the Shipibo. So it's largely an animistic worldview, which is that everything has a spirit. And that means everything. So that means that MDMA has a spirit. Psilocybin most certainly does have a spirit. Even crystal meth, has a really strong spirit. Agua Florida, which is the the flower water that's used in ceremonies, that's mass produced in New York. That's a relatively new creation from like the 80s, I think it is. Technically it's a room deodorizer, but it's used in Shipibo ceremonies for protection, to get rid of negative energies, because they found that the spirit of that is extremely effective for that. So all of these things have a spirit. So I don't feel that MDMA has less of a spirit than ayahuasca, for example. It's just a very different spirit. It's a synthetic spirit. And it's one that I'm sure you could work with, that you could get to know. And many people do work with it and have great effects from it. In terms of, you're, not from the Amazon, is it your medicine? Is it not your medicine? I mean, I think that different people are attracted to different medicines. The curanderos that I work with always say, if you're coming here with respect, if you're coming here with curiosity, if you're coming here for healing, then you're welcome. Then you're welcome to drink ayahuasca. If you want to be a student, if you really want to be a student, then we are willing to teach you, and we are happy to do that as well. Not all curanderos say that. I've heard even some shipibos say that you shouldn't be able to drink ayahuasca if you're not shipibo. So there are different views on this as well. But I don't see an issue with people from outside that culture engaging respectfully with ayahuasca, for example. There definitely is something to be said for engaging with the plants that are, or the synthetic medicines as well, that are more that are from your land, that are more kind of indigenous to you. And you may well feel that you have a stronger connection, but one of the issues with that is that there's less people who fully understand how to work with them. So it can be harder to do that in a safe and an effective way.
Yeah, that's interesting. I remember Zach Leary kind of saying, I'm from the indigenous LSD lineage, like, right? Fascinating. And I'm like, that's, wild. There are a handful of folks that have been at this for a number of decades that have wisdom, but it's different from the wisdom that's like multi-generational. But I can't say, like, I don't want to call it lesser because, like, let's not downplay Ram Dass, right? And how amazing that whole thing is.
Yeah, totally. And, one interesting thing, one of my friends gave one of the curanderos that we work with in the jungle, gave him a few tabs of LSD and then a small baggie of DMT crystal. And he'd never come across these before. He didn't know what they were, but he put them on his mat in ceremony, and he looked into it and he felt into the energy. Quite a common thing to do in ceremony. You can feel into the energy of something that we would consider an inanimate object. And his response, interestingly, for LSD was, this is an extremely powerful and visual medicine, but you will get illusions and it can become confusing for people. And then for DMT, he said, there's too much power in too small a thing for that crystal DMT. And he didn't know. He hasn't come across these things before, which I thought was interesting. So my perception of that was he's acknowledging them as medicines, but there's also risk with that because you're opening the doors to perception, potentially without the right training or the right people to guide you through that. And again, I'm not against this. I think in many ways we're beginning to form new traditions. It's a really exciting time. We're beginning to develop these new ways of working with these psychedelics. People are beginning to gain experience. People are beginning to learn how to work with them. And there's definitely, some things that could be transferable from indigenous cultures, not all of them, to inform us. But it's also, you should approach it with caution, is my perception.
Cool. So there's this whole body of literature that came out of Esalen, right? And there was a lot of things that went really scary. There's a lot of things that went really well there, but they had a extensive container that's not really like what we have today almost anywhere else. So on one hand, like, that was like the perfect place to do it. On the other hand, we're left with the West feeling like this, and I on one hand, I like, really, the Esalen stuff is really exciting, but like, we just don't have that anymore. And like, if somebody has a spiritual emergence or spiritual emergency, that's how kind of we talk about it, where do they go? And there's not, like, inpatient psychiatric hospitals are not the most pleasant places to be, or potentially harmful, right? Like, I think there was a paper recently about all-cause mortality increasing after an ER visit related to psychedelics. It's not pretty. Stay out of the ER, everybody. But like, I want to kind of characterize this danger more. Like, we don't really, like, we always say risk and danger when we talk about this kind of underheld psychedelic containers in Western culture. But like, from the Esalen perspective, there's these kind of like energetic awakenings that can happen that could be really risky or harmful, right? This is the kind of Kundalini awakening, or kind of like Shakti experience. And then there's potential issues with the energy system. If we look like a TCM lens, like, you're kind of getting kind of the circuit's all junked up or too activated. And then there's spirit attachments, like the idea of like something can have influence over you, some other kind of intelligence. And like we don't really talk about those things super openly or skillfully, I think, in this phase of the psychedelic experiment. Like, how do you like to talk about that stuff with people you work with?
So Don Rono gave this really good analogy, which really resonated with me. And so he said, if you take psychedelics in a setting that isn't held shamanically, basically, with somebody who has an understanding of how to work with these energies. And he was actually telling me this in response to me talking about the hospitals. He said, so that's a little bit like going to an airport and then just walking straight out onto the runway and just getting onto a random plane and not knowing which plane it is. And you could get on a plane that could take you to Ibiza, which is great, brilliant. Or you could open the door to a plane that takes you to Gaza. And you're blindly opening these doors. Now, it's not quite as simple as that, because I think intention has a lot to do with it, kind of what you're resonant with has a lot to do with it as well. But I think what he says stands, and that really, it makes a lot of sense to me. And in my experience, I definitely agree with that. But obviously, when you try to explain that to somebody outside of that paradigm, it just makes no sense. So if you're saying, when you take psychedelics, you potentially, open up your perception so that you can have contact with things that people can't normally see, these entities that exist, and they can communicate with you, they can interact with you. For people outside that paradigm, at best, they're going to think, okay, well, maybe. And at worst, they're going to think, well, that sounds like a delusional belief. That sounds psychotic. That sounds like a religious delusion. All of these different ways of labeling it. So I think the issue that we have is that there's this cultural clash. There's this clash of paradigms. And we can't get across this risk. And you're quite right. We can't define it because most people in the global north don't have an understanding of that in the same way that they do in traditional cultures. So I think that's really where the challenge lies. And if you suggest that to most scientists, most psychiatrists and researchers who are working in the psychedelic renaissance on hospital-based trials, at best they'd be slightly open, but there's no way you're going to convince an ethics board that that's a risk. This is something that we're just so far away from. And that I think is where the danger lies, that we have these two paradigms, interestingly, both actually saying the same about each other. So the indigenous curanderos obviously are saying, oh yeah, when you work psychedelics in hospitals, it's incredibly dangerous. I've also come across some psychiatrists who are like, these retreat centers, oh my God, you have a psychiatrist there, that's incredibly dangerous. It's like not next to a hospital. But unfortunately, there's just no communication and no understanding between the two, and kind of a lack of respect, I think, for each one.
Totally. So a little bit of a tangent here. I'm curious, have you encountered serotonin syndrome at any ayahuasca events?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, serotonin syndrome is the jury's out on whether psychedelics cause serotonin syndrome, or due to the amount that people were kind of scared, whether that's proportionate. So serotonin syndrome largely now is thought to be on a spectrum. So you don't either have serotonin syndrome or you don't. It depends. And so you can have differing degrees of it. Now, also a lot of the symptoms of serotonin syndrome, so the kind of changing your consciousness, shivering, shaking, sweating, all of these kinds of things, they're also symptoms of drinking ayahuasca. That's kind of what happens when you drink ayahuasca. So it's an interesting thing. There was a paper that came out by Callaway in the early 90s, basically warning about the serotonin syndrome with ayahuasca, with psychedelics. And that was specifically in relation to antidepressants. But every weekend throughout pretty much the whole of Brazil, there are people who drink ayahuasca in the Santo Daime, in the UDV. Loads of them are on antidepressants. They're not coming off their antidepressants, 2 weeks before and 2 weeks after. And there haven't been any recorded cases of deaths of serotonin syndrome in Brazil as a result of that. So I definitely think we need to be cautious. We definitely need to be more cautious than not cautious, but the jury's out scientifically on whether serotonin syndrome is as big of a risk as is made out to be in the literature.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's interesting. Like I've seen people that have had like a bad time after eating some 5-HTP at the wrong time, but not necessarily to the point where they needed medical attention.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I can only think of maximum 3 stories, but I've not really chased them down to like find out the real cause. And yeah, thanks for all that. It is a boogeyman. Like, how do we understand this one without talking about it more? And can
For
you
sure.
just like describe what is serotonin syndrome for people who aren't maybe in the know?
Yeah, it's a medical emergency when you get dangerously high levels of serotonin in your system. And so that can happen when you're stimulating the serotonin system from multiple different angles. So, for example, with selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, that prevents serotonin from being reuptaken. And so it's within your synaptic clefts, it's within your brain. And then also, if you then have a psychedelic, most of which are serotonin agonists, serotonin receptor agonists, then it's increasing the amount of serotonin, which can potentially be fatal. And it's not something to underestimate. It is a medical emergency, and we do need to take it seriously. But it's just interesting that almost every retreat center is so strict about coming off antidepressants. And I'm not saying they shouldn't do that, but it's just, is that really necessary? I mean, the evidence actually scientifically suggests probably not, but obviously better safe than sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm particularly concerned sometimes around like how much MDMA I see some people eat. When I know that they're also on psychiatric meds. I'm like, come on, like let's not push the button that hard.
For sure.
I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there is a limit as well. It's, you can't be eating huge amounts of MDMA and taking huge amounts of psychiatric medications.
It's a bad idea.
Mm-hmm.
So being in the UK, do you get exposure to kind of MDMA overuse people at all? Like, it's a big rave culture. I'm sure it's not purely MDMA in those people, but like, do you see that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the UK has a reputation of going too far, I think, when it comes to drinking and when it comes to drugs. And I used to work in something called PsyCare, which is it's kind of the UK equivalent of Cosmicare. And that organization is a fantastic charity. They go to music festivals and they kind of look after people having challenging drug experiences. And a lot of those people were consuming huge amounts of MDMA, and they're getting towards the serotonin syndrome kind of symptoms. But again, it's a scale. It's a scale, and it's fluid rather than this person. You're either in serotonin syndrome or you're not.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see. What might we have missed? I'm sure there's some stuff we haven't talked about that you're interested in and working on.
I can tell you about our most recent research with the veterans.
Please.
I think it's quite interesting. So yeah, we're in the second year of a 5-year study looking at military veterans with PTSD in the Amazon rainforest. And so far, we've had just over 40 participants go through the retreats and go through the whole study. Well, 6-month follow-up. And so we're looking at changes in their brain waves according to EEG. We're looking at changes in their gut microbiome, epigenetics, and psychometrics. And in terms of the psychometrics, at the moment, at 6-month follow-up, we found that 84% of our participants no longer meet our criteria, so the PCL5, which is a measure of PTSD. Now, I do need to caveat this saying it's observational research and hasn't been peer-reviewed and published yet, so that might change. We're in the second year of the study. But already it's suggesting a really positive effect, a really positive result. So that's particularly interesting for me.
Yeah. And that you said was with Heroic Hearts, the UK version, UK branch?
So we work mainly with the US version, but also, so I'm the Chief Medical Officer for Heroic Hearts UK, and we get some UK vets and a few Australians. I'm the CMO for Australia as well, actually, but mainly the US.
Yeah. And are they they're mainly working with mushrooms these days, right?
They do a lot of mushrooms, for sure, a lot of mushroom retreats, but there's a solid supply of them, of these veterans going over to drink ayahuasca as well.
Cool. Yeah, the gut microbiome stuff's fascinating. Like, do you, so like what, oh man, well, so this is an interesting approach that Heroic Hearts has taken, right? They're doing some stuff in the traditional containers, some stuff in semi-Western containers. And like I wonder, like optimistically, what kind of data we might be able to expect out of these larger kind of veterans projects. Like, are you hopeful for anything in particular?
I mean, I would love to do some comparisons from, kind of near shamanic kind of clinics to as close as we can get to traditional. Arguably, you can never get a fully kind of traditional setup to hospital based, and not to kind of not to try and kind of prove which one is best, but I would imagine that they're going to be better at different things. Just as different psychedelics are probably going to be better at treating different things. So I would love to do that comparison, but it's so hard because the data is just not uniform. But yeah, I mean, that would be a dream of mine.
Right. I'm sure there's a way, like, actually, how would you think about that? So say we were able to implement some sort of study, but clearly the methods are so different and everything's like really different. Like, would there be a way to just track the measures before and after, despite like the difference in protocol?
Yeah, totally. I mean, you'd have to have the uniform methodology, even though the dosing obviously would be completely different in a hospital versus in the Amazon rainforest. But you at least have to have relatively similar measures at similar time points, so you can make that comparison. The more heterogeneous, the more different it gets harder and harder to make a meaningful comparison.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I was reading a paper yesterday about comparing two different forms of circular breath work and the impact on like CO2 in the body. I think it was in Nature. And they were actually, very different in length of time, the two different methods. So they had to take their samples of, saliva and air at like different intervals proportionally to the length of the, treatment or, experiment. It's fascinating to like, have that kind of problem. But thankfully the data was consistent between the two, so it made sense.
That's cool.
Yeah,
that sounds like a good paper.
Yeah. What was it? Comparing conscious connected breath and holotropic breath work. Anyway, are you like how we're coming close on time, so I don't want to open a big can of worms, but like what would you say are some things that UK ayahuasca culture could learn and implement better for, better performance and safety that you're not seeing
UK
yet?
ayahuasca culture.
Right.
Yeah. Actually do the training. Like would be really great. So like do a proper apprenticeship where you're working alongside somebody for years and years and years and years. And then you get permission to, to start serving yourself. To do that is vital. I mean, you wouldn't go to a medical doctor, you wouldn't go to a surgeon. And Shipibo, they're called the spiritual surgeons. That's what people refer to them as. You wouldn't go to a surgeon who had just kind of done work experience like a few times. So that taking it seriously really kind of, they call it the path of no ego as well. Accepting that you know nothing for years and years and just kind of building up would be the way, it would make such a huge difference. Doing it respectfully, obviously, like it has to be this respectful collaboration that's reciprocal and that is filled with love and filled with trust. And also that takes years. It takes years to build those relationships with Indigenous peoples in order to do that kind of apprenticeship. So it's a lifelong path. It's not something that you just kind of dabble in. I think people really need to know that before they embark on that journey, and definitely before they start hosting ceremonies.
Cool. Yeah, I see a lot of people doing things with ayahuasca, and it's really uncomfortable to know that they're undertrained. I, for whatever reason, I think rightfully so, though, have this bias that ayahuasca does require that level of training, and other things are a little softer in a lot of cases. But yeah, I just would love to see more people with ayahuasca training doing, ayahuasca more safely as a result of all that training. I'm with you. Sure. Yeah. It's just a lifelong thing.
Yeah. It never stops. When I first got into this work, I thought I want to see how deep the rabbit hole goes, and now 6 years later, I'm almost certain it's infinite. It's like Western medicine. It's a constant training, constant development over the whole of your life.
Yeah. Cool. And what about things that we might say to other psychiatrists who have yet to kind of understand this animist worldview? Like, is it kind of like the Terrence McKenna line? Do you have 10 minutes? How do you like to think of that?
I think it's just having that openness. I don't expect people to transform their worldviews. It took me 4 years drinking ayahuasca regularly, going back and forth to the jungle, having curanderos saying, this is what's happening, this is what's happening. And it took me 4 years to get to that point of accepting it.
Mm-hmm.
So just to have that openness, that understanding that Western medicine is just one form of medicine. When we say medicine, most of the time we think, that's like Western medicine. That's going to a hospital. That's going to a medical doctor. That is one form of medicine. There are many, many different forms of medicine. Ayahuasca, traditional medicine is another one. Acupuncture, the list goes on. Just having that openness to these different forms, and also understanding that, in Western medicine, we've put ourselves in a dominant position where we have the power to either validate or not to validate other practices, like indigenous practices. And just remembering that it's an unfair game to do that. It's rigged, like science is rigged to suit Western science. And our research methods, like randomized control trials, fantastic. They're absolutely fantastic, but they're designed for our pharmaceutical drugs. So just having that openness and having that understanding there are different ways of doing things, and they require different forms of investigation in order to understand them.
Yeah. So, all right, where can people follow up and learn more about you and your work?
Sure. So you can go to our website. So we have onaya.io. And on that website, that's where we run courses actually that train people to be in preparation and integration mentors. And that's again bridging the gap. So it's psychiatrists, neuroscientists, psychologists, and then also curanderos, Tibetan nuns, Ayurvedic practitioners. They're all on there to give that holistic view to the psychedelic experience. And then we have our research website, which is onaya.science. And Onaya is Onaya. And then I also have my own personal website, which is drsimonruffell.com.
Well, Dr. Simon Ruffell, thank you so much for being here, and I hope we get to do more in the future.
I hope so. Always a pleasure, Joe. I'll speak to you soon.
All right, thanks.